In a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Minnesota, Linda and George Thompson lived a life that seemed distant from the rest of the world. Their house stood like an island, separated from the lives of those around them. George was known in the area not because he was friendly or social, but because of his extreme size. Weighing nearly 300 kilograms, George rarely left his house. His life was confined to his living room, where he spent his days lying on a reinforced bed, surrounded by food wrappers, soda bottles, and stacks of pillows to support his massive body. For years, the townspeople whispered about him, some in sympathy, others in judgment, but no one truly understood what life was like behind those closed doors. Linda had married George years before his health began to decline. In the beginning, things were different. They were young, happy, and hopeful. But as time passed, George's weight slowly became the center of their lives. His small health issues turned into serious medical conditions. Linda found herself caring for him more and more, until eventually, her entire world revolved around his needs. What started as love gradually transformed into responsibility, then into burden, and finally into quiet resentment. She became his nurse, his maid, his cook, and his only lifeline to the outside world. As George's size increased, his ability to move vanished. He could no longer get out of bed without assistance. He couldn't walk to the bathroom or stand in the kitchen. Linda had to help him with every small task. She brought him food on demand, cleaned his body with sponges, and managed all of his medications. Day and night, she lived in service to him. She missed family events, she stopped working, and she drifted away from her friends. Slowly, she vanished from her own life. At first, she told herself this was what love required. She had promised to stand by him in sickness and in health. But as the years dragged on, her patience thinned. George became demanding, expecting constant attention. He rang a small bell when he wanted something, and if Linda didn't respond quickly, he shouted. Until she came. His size gave him power over her life. Linda wasn't free to sleep, to eat in peace, or to leave the house for more than a few minutes at a time. Every choice she made was tied to his needs. Neighbors occasionally noticed that Linda looked exhausted. They sometimes saw her at the grocery store buying massive amounts of food, filling her cart with bags of chips, sugary drinks, and processed meals. They assumed she was doing what she could to care for her husband. They didn't realize how trapped she felt inside that house. She stopped inviting people over. She stopped answering calls. Even her own family grew distant, unsure of how to help her or if she even wanted help. Inside, Linda's feelings darkened. She stopped seeing George as her husband. To her, he had become a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She didn't know how to leave him. She didn't know how to survive without him either. The life insurance policy she had taken out months earlier rested quietly in a drawer, its value growing like a secret hope. In public, she remained calm, but privately, she began to see only one way out. The thought started as a whisper, a quiet idea at the back of her mind, but it grew louder every day. Her life had been swallowed by the endless care for George, and the door to her freedom seemed to be locked from the inside. The key, she thought, might be in her own hands. The house that Linda and George Thompson shared became more than just a home. It turned into a cage. As George's body grew heavier, the walls seemed to close in around them. George was now fully dependent on Linda for every part of his survival. He could not walk, he could not roll over by himself, and he could not reach even the simplest things without Linda's help. Every day began with the sound of George ringing his bell, signaling that it was time for his breakfast, his medication, or simply his desire for company. Linda's life no longer belonged to her. It belonged to him. The house was a silent battlefield where Linda's quiet suffering went unnoticed. She had cut herself off from everyone. Old friends had stopped visiting long ago after their calls went unanswered. Her family gave up trying to reach her, convinced that she had chosen this life. No one knew the weight she was carrying. It wasn't just George's physical size, it was the crushing burden of being the only one responsible for keeping him alive. She cooked for him, bathed him, and ordered massive quantities of food to satisfy his endless appetite. Every day was a cycle of feeding, cleaning, and medicating, repeated over and over like a loop she could never escape. Linda began to think carefully about her future. She started reading about life insurance policies and how they worked. George's size made him high risk, but that was exactly why the policy was so valuable. When she first applied for it, she told herself it was a safety net, something that would help them if George's health worsened. But deep down, it was already becoming something else. It was becoming a way out. The thought crept into her mind in pieces, never fully forming all at once. She told herself it was only a backup plan. But that backup plan soon became the center of everything. The more George demanded, the less Linda cared. She began feeding him foods she knew were harmful: greasy burgers, piles of fries, sugar-loaded desserts, and fried snacks that George could never resist. She would place large portions in front of him, silently watching him eat as if the food was the only thing keeping him happy. She made sure his favorite items were always available. She knew exactly what she was doing. Each meal, each missed medication, each ignored health warning was another step toward the edge. Neighbors sometimes saw Linda carrying heavy bags of food into the house, but they never asked questions. Everyone assumed George's condition was simply the result of years of overeating. No one thought his wife would ever want him gone. No one imagined she was quietly pushing him toward his own destruction. On the outside, Linda's life looked like a story of dedication. On the inside, it was a story of quiet rebellion. Linda stopped scheduling doctor visits. When nurses from the health center called to check on George, she told them he was doing fine, just resting, too tired to talk. She avoided their offers to send home care workers. She made sure no one else came into the house. Slowly, she removed all outside interference. George's world shrank to the size of his bed, and Linda controlled every detail of it. She was careful, calculated, and patient. There were no arguments, no visible abuse, no bruises to explain away. She used food as her weapon, knowing that George would never refuse what she offered him. As George's health spiraled downward, Linda found a strange peace in her routine. She began to feel lighter, as if the walls of the house were not pressing on her as hard. The life she wanted was still out of reach, but it was no longer impossible. The path she was following was dark, but to her, it felt like the only way forward. And each passing day, she moved closer to the moment when she would finally be free. George's health slipped quietly and steadily. His breathing grew shallow, his heart strained under the pressure of his enormous weight, and his skin began to show signs of damage. Bedsores appeared on his back and legs, painful openings that Linda cleaned just enough to keep them from becoming emergencies. She knew the signs of worsening health. She recognized the quiet warnings from his body, but she did nothing to stop it. She simply let nature run its course, with a little help from her silent decisions. The house became a place of slow decay. George could not stand, could not turn, and could not care for his own body. His dependence on Linda was absolute. He trusted her fully, believing she was his only hope for survival. He never suspected that the hands feeding him, medicating him, and washing him were guiding him to the edge of life. George continued to eat whatever Linda brought him. He had no idea that his most important medications were slowly disappearing. Sometimes Linda would skip his doses entirely. Other times, she would crush the pills and scatter them in the trash, letting the heart medication and blood pressure pills go unused. Linda played her role perfectly. She showed concern when George complained of chest pains. She brought him water. When he coughed, she called him sweet names while quietly watching him suffer. To anyone on the outside, she was the picture of loyalty. Inside, she felt nothing but cold determination. The goal was clear now, and she was no longer afraid of what needed to happen. The weight of caring for George had crushed her spirit for years, but now she was in control. As George's condition deteriorated, Linda deliberately increased the size of his meals. She overloaded his plates with greasy meats, oily fries, and sugar-packed cakes. She offered him soda instead of water, salty snacks instead of fruit. She encouraged him to eat more, pushing second and third helpings until he could barely speak from exhaustion. She knew exactly what the food was doing to him, and she pushed harder every day. She was careful to maintain the appearance of a caring wife, but her actions were deliberate. Every bite was part of her quiet plan. The months dragged on, each day blending into the next. Linda's life had become a strange routine of pretending to save a man while slowly ensuring his end. She no longer felt guilt. She no longer hesitated. She had spent too many years in the shadows of George's weight. Too many nights awake with the sound of his heavy breathing filling the house. She had made up her mind, and now all she had to do was wait. Linda kept careful records of her grocery orders and household bills. She made sure everything looked normal on paper. When she purchased George's favorite high-fat meals, she paid in cash. When she discarded his unused medications, she did so in small amounts, never enough to raise concern. She was patient and methodical. The quietness of the house became almost peaceful to Linda. The control she once lacked now belonged fully to her. She had built a perfect system where she could move through each day as if nothing was wrong, but each small decision was taking George further away from life. The process was slow, almost invisible, but it was happening exactly as she intended. The moment was approaching. Linda knew that soon she would call emergency services. Soon she would unlock the door to her freedom. All she had to do was finish what she had started. One cold morning, Linda finally made the call. Her voice was calm as she told emergency services that her husband had passed away in his sleep. She reported that she found him unresponsive and that his breathing had stopped during the night. When the paramedics arrived, they struggled to navigate the narrow hallways to reach George's massive body. The scene appeared as expected. George lay motionless, his face pale, surrounded by the familiar clutter of food wrappers and medical supplies. There were no visible injuries, no signs of struggle, and no immediate cause for suspicion. His weight alone seemed enough to explain his death. The paramedics completed their routine checks, and the initial report listed George's passing as natural, likely caused by heart failure linked to his extreme obesity. Linda watched quietly as they worked, her face carefully composed, offering polite answers to their questions. She showed sadness when required, but inside, she felt something else. It wasn't joy, but a strange, empty relief, as though the heavy door that had trapped her for so long had finally swung open. The investigation would have ended there if not for the sharp instincts of Detective Aaron Wallace, who happened to review the case. Something about the timing unsettled her. George had been gravely ill for years, yet his wife had recently taken out a large life insurance policy that had gone into effect just months before his death. It was a small detail that might have been overlooked, but Wallace had seen enough cases to know when something wasn't quite right. She began to dig quietly into Linda's life. She looked through pharmacy records and found that George's essential medications hadn't been refilled consistently in the months leading to his death. There were unexplained gaps, missed doses, and canceled orders. She then tracked Linda's food purchases and noticed the pattern. Frequent orders of unhealthy fast food. Delivery receipts showing meals large enough to feed several people, all delivered to a home with only 2 occupants, one of whom was severely immobile. Detective Wallace visited the neighbors, asking if they had seen George in recent months. Many hadn't seen him in over a year. Some recalled seeing Linda carrying large bags of food, but few remembered any medical visits or signs of urgent care. Linda had managed to keep everyone at a distance, locking the house into a secret routine that no one else had witnessed. The breakthrough came when Wallace obtained Linda's internet search history. Linda had spent countless hours researching slow methods of causing death without leaving clear evidence. She had looked into the effects of untreated heart conditions, the long-term damage of excessive sodium and sugar, and the failure of essential organs when medications are skipped. She had even searched whether insurance companies investigate deaths tied to obesity, and how policies are typically paid out in such cases. When presented with the findings, the insurance company delayed payment, triggering an official review of George's death. A deeper examination of his body revealed inconsistencies, signs of prolonged malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and medication imbalances that couldn't be fully explained by his size alone. The slow decline had been orchestrated with care, giving the appearance of a natural death while being quietly shaped by Linda's deliberate choices. Detective Wallace built her case piece by piece, uncovering the carefully hidden evidence that revealed Linda's long silent plan. Linda had thought she created the perfect crime, one that moved so slowly no one would notice until it was too late. But her attention to detail was the very thing that drew the detective's eye. It wasn't violence that killed George. It was the absence of care, the removal of the very things that kept him alive, all hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly devoted wife. The evidence against Linda continued to build. Detective Wallace collected financial records, witness statements, and medical reports, each thread tightening around the quiet story Linda had tried to control. The case gained attention in the local community as whispers of intentional neglect began to surface. People who had once pitied Linda started to question what had really happened behind the closed doors of that house. The idea that a wife could slowly lead her husband to death without raising alarms unsettled everyone who heard it. It was not the story of a sudden crime. It was a quiet, patient unraveling that had stretched over months. When the case went to trial, Linda showed little emotion. She sat quietly as the prosecution presented the timeline of her decisions. They explained how she had isolated George from medical help, how she had deliberately overfed him with foods that worsened his condition, and how she had carefully manipulated his medication schedule to push his body toward collapse. They showed the internet searches, the gaps in his treatment, and the suspiciously timed life insurance policy. Every detail painted a picture of premeditation, not carelessness. The defense argued that Linda had simply been overwhelmed. They suggested that she had made mistakes, not murder. They tried to convince the court that George's death was inevitable given his size and failing health, and that Linda had done her best under impossible circumstances. But the pattern was too clear. The prosecution's evidence was quiet but undeniable. Linda hadn't lashed out in anger. She hadn't used force. She had simply stopped trying to save him. The jury found Linda guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict stunned the community. People struggled to decide how to feel about her. Some saw her as a cold, calculating killer who slowly ended her husband's life for financial gain. Others saw her as a woman pushed to the edge, suffocated by years of exhaustion and isolation. Her sentence was heavy, but public opinion remained divided. Some believed she deserved more sympathy, while others saw her as dangerous in her silence. In prison, Linda kept to herself. She rarely spoke about the case and never expressed regret. To her, the freedom she had imagined never truly arrived. She had spent years dreaming of a life without George, but when it finally came, it wasn't the freedom she expected. Her life outside had been a prison of responsibility, but the one she found herself in now had walls she couldn't escape. She had traded one kind of cage for another. The story stayed alive long after the trial ended. It became a subject of true crime documentaries and quiet conversations among neighbors. The idea that someone could commit murder not with violence, but with patience and silence fascinated many. It challenged what people thought they knew about crime and about love. It was a case that made people question whether neglect, when carefully planned, could be as deadly as any weapon. Detective Wallace often thought about Linda. The case had disturbed her not because of the method, but because of the mindset behind it. There had been no sudden loss of control, no act of passion. It had been methodical and cold. Linda had lived alongside George, day after day, serving him with one hand while slowly removing his chances of survival with the other. In the end, George became the victim of both his own body and the quiet decisions of the person closest to him. Linda became a symbol of how desperation can twist into something dark when there seems to be no way out. The story closed with a haunting reminder that some of the most dangerous crimes happen not in moments of rage, but in the long silent spaces where love turns into something unrecognizable.